This episode was first recorded in November 2017. Ed Fear, what is your favourite game?
My favourite... Oh, wait, no, sorry, I forgot. I've forgotten already. What do I say?
Ed Fear, what is your favourite game?
My favourite game is Xenogears. I guess I got started playing games when I had friends. When I was maybe like 5 or 6, I had friends that lived on my street that had an NES, and I remember going to one of their houses and playing the first Mario, which came out the year I was born, 1985. So it would have been a bit after the fact, really. But I remember playing the first Mario and just not really being able to comprehend how incredible it was that I was controlling what was going on the screen. Like, to me, TV had always been something that you watched. And I was suddenly like, wait, I'm controlling it? And it was just the most magical thing I'd ever seen in my life. And from that moment on, I was just completely hooked. Whenever I went to friends' houses, all I wanted to do was play on their consoles or their computers, and I eventually convinced my parents to get me an NES, and it just went from there. I just became a complete addict, really.
Like what games did you get for your NES? Obviously, Mario would have been one of them.
Yeah, Mario was definitely a big one. I remember playing a lot of Mario 2 as well, and obviously Mario 3 when that came out. I was a big fan of Zelda, obviously, the first Zelda. I only ever played Zelda 2 when I was at my cousin's house, and I was like, no, I don't think this is the game for me, which, I later learned was what a lot of people felt about that one. So like Zelda, there was a really weird Capcom platformer that my friend had called Little Nemo in Dreamland. Which was this like super hardcore platformer that was really surreal, but we were addicted to it. And it was so hard, but I can remember we used to play it for hours and hours, and then like leave it on overnight so that the next morning we could play again. Because it was obviously before save states and things like that. And I remember once my mum went away on a holiday. My mum and dad went away, and I went to stay with my auntie and uncle, and to make me miss them less, I guess, they just bought me a game. They bought one completely at random. They had no idea what was good, and they bought Mega Man 2, and that was a huge awakening. That was the idea that a game wasn't a linear sequence of levels, and that you could choose which level you tackled in each order. And then each level made you stronger for the other ones. I remember being quite blown away by that, I think. And then after the NES, I went on to I betrayed Nintendo and went Sega.
Traitor!
I know. So I got Mega Drive because I was a really big Sonic fan. I loved Sonic, and it was just something about the speed and the insanity of it just kind of mesmerized me a little bit. But yeah, I didn't really have that much on the Mega Drive because, looking back, there wasn't really that many amazing games on the Mega Drive. I used to love Sonic Spinball, which was a terrible game objectively, but I used to play it a lot. And Street Fighter 2 was a big one that I used to play all the time as well. And that was a game that even got my brother playing with me. My brother and sister are much older than me, and they've never really been into games. But Street Fighter was always one that that I could get my brother to play with me, and so that was a lot of fun. And then after the Mega Drive, I went to PlayStation, so I betrayed Sega. Obviously, what we're learning is that I'm a turncoat, and will just flip-flop around at will. But yeah, PlayStation was what I consider my like golden era of gaming. PlayStation 1. I think it's partly because it was the age I was at the time, which would have been, between about probably like 13 and probably younger than that, like 12 and 16, I guess, was kind of the PlayStation era for me. So that to me was the time that like the real possibilities of games opened up to me. Like I remember playing Parappa the Rapper and just being like, I had no idea that a game could be like this, and just finding it so weird. And that was another one that my brother and even my sister really loved, Parappa the Rapper, because it was so surreal and weird and accessible. But the real one game that got me in my PlayStation days was the one that a lot of people will say, and that's Final Fantasy VII, because that game just hit me like a bolt out of the blue. I'd never heard of, like most people in Europe, I'd never heard of the franchise before, and I remember reading about it in a magazine and just being like, oh yeah, this seems like it could be really fun, and like really looking forward to it, but just like being just completely blown away like every 5 minutes by that game, because it was just like, it was so cinematic and the story was so powerful. I mean, to me at the time at least. And I had no idea that games could have those kinds of stories, and give you that kind of long experience in a way. So that was really my first RPG, I think. I played games like Zelda and Zelda 64 and stuff, but Final Fantasy was a very different beast. It's the archetypal JRPG, and that basically that set off my love for that genre, which has pretty much continued to this day.
Like I would have said, like before, with the games you mentioned, like the original Mario and Mega Man, and like at least in part with Zelda, that you would have had a sort of platforming love at first before jumping into like your love of RPGs. I think that would have been at least somewhat fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was even going into the PS1. I think one of the games I got with my PS1 was a game called Pandemonium, which was a platformer by Crystal Dynamics, and it was a 2.5D platformer, so it was 3D, but like in one plane, but the plane kept on moving, and that was another one of those like, what the hell moments, that really got me. And I'd also was a big fan of the first Tomb Raider as well. The first Tomb Raider was the first game I played which I guess you could kind of say has a lot of platforming elements to it. And that was the first game I played where I really felt the sense of a three-dimensional space. I think it's the bit at the very beginning where you can swim through an underground tunnel. And that was the moment where I was like, oh my God, this is a whole nother like dimension. And, a lot of people attribute, Mario 64 as being the game that first kind of made you understand how incredible 3D could be. And maybe because I didn't have an N64 at the time, for me it was Tomb Raider. And I remember speaking about this with Terry Pratchett, and he had said exactly the same, that Tomb Raider was his first game that he really understood what 3D movement could kind of, the sense it could give you of exploring a place. And I remember being like, oh my God, you're the only other person that's ever said that to me.
That's insane. Like, there was a lot of 3D platformers that, since Mario, that would have I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just babbling at this point. But I kind of do get your point anyways about... Like, I never got an N64, so I can't really talk about Mario 64 in the same vein that everyone else has. Like, for me, that kind of big 3D explosion was the original Crash Bandicoot. And that was when I got my PlayStation about 20 years ago. It was actually 20 years ago Christmas, actually. And I remember just being so amazed by what games had been able to do even up to that point, because even before I got my PlayStation, I was like playing Donkey Kong on a Game Boy, like, and it was like, you know, it was fine, it was good, but then having that kind of explosion over from green pixely 2D screen up into this colourful 3D world with Crash, I can honestly see why there was such a massive explosion of sorts, anyways, in terms of what could be possible with the future games. Crash Bandicoot was those levels where you were running into the screen, right? Those were they were really annoying as hell, but they were also like, whoa, this is 3D. Exactly.
It really, I mean, even though you were really only playing those in a 2D plane, it still felt very 3D.
Yes.
Crash Bandicoot was definitely. I remember really looking forward to that game Croc. Because I remember looking at the previews of it and being like, yeah, finally there's going to be a game like Mario 64 on the PlayStation. It's going to be amazing. And then playing the demo and just being like, no. In the days of the PlayStation demo disc. Which again I used to love. I was a huge magazine reader, gaming magazines. I was obsessed with games magazines, and I would just buy as many as I possibly could, and especially for demo discs. I loved demo discs. I have there's a weird. I wish I still have them in a way, because they're like a time capsule, of the games that were big at that point. And there were so many demos that I used to just play again and again and again. I used to love the PlayStation ones because they had the Net Eurose games on them.
Yes,
as well. And I actually had a Net Eurose. I only ever got as far as making a Space Invaders clone, using pictures that I ripped out of South Park. But it ran on a PlayStation. I felt pretty proud of myself. The games, those sort of games that people would make, sometimes there'd just be this random game on there and it would just be insanely good. It was like the indie scene before the indie scene happened, in a way.
Dear God, and that Yahtzee game with South Park, that would have been amazing scenes. should have released that as a homebrew.
I should have, really. I can't remember. I think I was obsessed with learning how to do 3D, and so I just dropped it after a while. But that was the first time I learned how difficult 3D programming was. Trying to do that basically killed any remaining interest I had, I think, which was a bit of a shame. The best thing. So this is very relevant, actually. The best thing about the Net Eurose was that it was a region-free PlayStation 1.
Yes, that's right.
And that's how and once I got that, I started importing. After playing Final Fantasy VII, I started learning more about JRPGs in general because I hadn't known anything about this genre, and I started going on the internet. It's dial up at the time, and going to loads of forums and for RPG fans, and learning about all of these games that were like Final Fantasy that I hadn't played. And whenever one would come out in Europe, which they started doing after Final Fantasy VII proved so insanely popular, I'd buy it. And they'd never quite be as good as a Final Fantasy, because the budgets would have been much smaller or whatever. But through these forums and stuff, I would learn about all the games that were kind of American in those days. so many more JRPGs came out in America than ever came out in Europe. So I started importing them. I think the first one I imported was Final Fantasy VIII, which I had 6 months before anyone in England or whatever. I think that was the first one. Then Final Fantasy Tactics, and some other stuff. And I had a friend who also got into JRPGs about the same time from Final Fantasy VII, and so we would kind of import different games and then swap them or tell each other about them. And he was the one that bought Xenogears, and he bought it and he played it. And I remember he gave it to me and he was like, "You really, really need to play this game. It's just insane." And I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, whatever," not really thinking much of it. And then I actually got into it, and I don't think I ever gave it back. It was just too special to me after that. Weirdly, when I was about 13 or 14, I think I did. I have really hazy memories, but I did write some reviews for some websites, some small ones, where they would send me the games. And I remember thinking I was the king of the hill, because I was like, yeah, I'm 14, people are sending me games, and I wasn't getting paid, but to a 14-year-old, just getting the game for free was pretty awesome. And then I decided I wanted to get into games development, partly because of a few games that really opened my eyes to the possibilities of the medium, which like Final Fantasy VII, like Xenogears, like Silent Hill 2, which I'm sure we'll touch upon later. But I always thought I was going to be a programmer, and that's why I got the Net Eurozone, to learn programming and stuff like that. And then I decided to go to university, and I decided to study. It was always assumed I'd do computer science, but I didn't really want to, because I was like, that kind of sounds a bit dull, and also I know a lot of it already because I self-taught programming so many years ago. So I did a joint honours degree that was half computer science and half Japanese, because I'd been playing all of these JRPGs, and I was like, hey, this country makes pretty cool stuff. It would be pretty cool to be able to play the games before they even get translated into English, So I went to university, but again, I was expecting to get into the industry as a programmer. And then in my final year, I was talking to a good friend that I'd known for many years, Simon Parkin, just one day on MSN Messenger, and he was like, "Have you ever thought about trying games journalism?" And I was like, "No, not really." And he said, "Well, I've seen your forum posts. I know you could do it if you wanted to." And I just really, even though I'd done it before when I was much younger, I hadn't really ever thought about doing it again. So I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'll keep that in mind." And then weirdly, a friend of mine got a job on a blog, the website Pocket Gamer, which now is a relatively big website. But back then that was when it had just launched, and it was, mobile phones weren't really a gaming platform at that point. And they had a blog which they were trying to launch, and like I said, my friend got offered some work on it, and so I emailed the guy who was running it, and I was like, "Hey, how about I do some stuff for your blog as well? I can read Japanese, so how about I summarize articles from Famitsu and write them into posts?" And he was like, "Yeah, okay, cool." And I remember he paid me £5 per post, which obviously not great looking back, but it kind of got started, and then they started up the website proper, and that was with a lot of Pocket Gamer was launched by a lot of old Edge people. So it was so So the guy that was working the blog was was a guy called Owen Benelak. And then they said, do you want to start working on the main site and doing some reviews? And we'll send you the games and we'll obviously pay you a lot more than £5 a post. And that guy, the guy that was running that was Joao Diniz Sanchez, who used to be the editor of Edge. And I remember, and I was such a huge fan of Edge when I was like 15, 16. I would read it and I thought it was so, grown up and interesting and really looked at games like they were a proper thing. And he was like, yeah, do you want to like try doing a review? And I was terrified because I was like, oh my God, he really knows what he's doing. So anyway, I did it. And that kind of grew into a much longer thing during my final year of university where I was doing a lot of this work for Pocket Gamer, paying my way through university without having to leave bed, which was basically the dream. And then about 2 months before I finished university, I saw a job opening at Develop magazine, which closed down today, which is a weird turn of events.
Yeah.
But yeah, I saw they had that, and I thought, well, I do really want to get into development, but this could be interesting, and this could get me to a lot of conferences and meet a lot of people. So I went for the job. I got offered it. And basically I was offered a job before I did my final exam. So at that point I was like, well, I'd be an idiot not to take a job because I was really worried about what I was going to do after I finished university. So I did that, moved to Hertfordshire to do that. Only really intended to stay 6 months while I found a job, proper job in the industry. Proper job would be a term I would have used then, not now. I ended up staying there for about 3 years because it was just great. I mean, it was, I got to go to GDC and I think I went like 4 times. I was flying around the world just so many times and got to meet incredible people and interview like my heroes. And, I got to shake hands with Kojima. I remember that. That was pretty cool. I got to interview people like Warren Spector, who I respected so much for what he'd done on like Deus Ex and stuff like that, and just so many other people. It basically it was just, yeah, it was like it was crazy looking back. But eventually, I got tired of that and actually wanted to get into the industry. So I moved over to Curve Studios. Who are now Curve Digital, like an indie publisher. But back then they were a developer rather than a publisher. And I worked there doing some PR stuff for their first self-published game. And while I was there, I also I basically volunteered to write all of the games that they were making at that point. Because I really wanted to get into game writing. But I didn't really know how to do it.
And talk about biting off more than you can chew. I don't know. It's like taking on all the games right in there at the time. I don't know.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I was there 2 years, and it was. I wrote 3 games, and they all launched within about the first 18 months. I mean, there wasn't a huge amount of text in a lot of them, but it was basically what happened was that I just kind of let them know that I was interested in that. But then I remember. They published a game called Explodemon, which was the game I did a lot of PR on, and all kinds of production-y things. And they were talking about hiring a writer and like being young and having no like crippling, self-doubt, which I've developed over time. I was like, hey, why don't you let me, rather than hire someone, why don't you let me give it a go, and if you don't like it, then you can hire someone anyway. But if you do like it, then you've saved money. And saying that to an independent developer is like that's exactly what they want to hear. So they were like, yeah, okay, and then ended up doing everything there. Yeah, like I say, worked on all of the games that they released. I got to write the script for. I co-wrote the script for one of the Buzz games. So that was interesting because you got to write stuff that then Jason Donovan would then record, and you'd get back and you'd be like, oh, okay, that's not how that line went at all, but I guess no one bothered to correct you. And so you just have to go with it. Like, it was very strange. But yeah, so I was at Curve for about 2 years, and then I moved over to where I am now, which is Mediatonic. Because even though I'd written all of the games there, I was primarily a producer at Curve. And I wanted to get more into the creative side of things, and there wasn't really much opportunity to do that at Curve. So Mediatonic headhunted me and said, you can do more creative things. And I was like, well, that sounds exactly like what I want to do. So I did that, and I worked on a Moshi Monsters game for mobile phones that got cancelled after about a year. That was with a Japanese company called Gree. And then I started work on the game that I did with Square Enix Japan, Heaven Strike Rivals, which took about 3 to 4 years of my life and left me a lot older and more tired, but very happy, very fulfilled, I will say. So that's what I did that, and then I've been working on various other things that have been cancelled over the years, and that's how we get to today.
Your fingertips moving gently to my heart. The force of life goes on and on.
Right, let's talk about your favorite game then. Xenogears, or Xenogears as I call it. Is it Xeno or Xeno? Does it really matter?
It doesn't matter, but I will defend Xeno until the day I die. No, Americans call it Xenogears. In Japanese, it's Xenogears. And I guess we would say Xeno because it's Xeno as in xenophobia. But Americans would say Xeno. So yeah, it doesn't really matter, but yeah, I try and say Xeno.
It's semantics, basically.
Pretty much, yeah.
So hands up, I've not played Xenogears. I've not even gone near it.
Nope.
If I was someone coming in to Xenogears, if you had to pitch me on Xenogears, what would you give me as an elevator pitch to the game?
Oh my god. How would I do that? That's so difficult. So first of all, I would say it's no surprise you've not played it because not many people did. I think it sold about 1 million copies. It didn't come out in Europe anyway, in the end. Meeting somebody who's played Xenogears is like an amazing moment when you meet someone. You're like, oh my god, you've played Xenogears! Oh my god! Which is kind of a nice thing in some ways.
Kind of like a giddy feeling.
Yeah, it is. And you go, oh my god. So Xenogears is a. So what would I say? Xenogears is a. It's a JRPG, but it's one that is extremely ambitious. Its scope is insane. And it's basically one of the most detailed, confusing, exciting stories. It's basically the wonderful thing about Xenogears is that so it's like, every JRPG almost follows like a template in terms of the hero is in their village and then something goes wrong and then they are sent on an adventure in order to right a wrong or defeat an evil, and then the world becomes a happy place again. And Xenogears is basically a game that turns all of that on its head. It starts out very familiar in some ways, in that it starts out with a hero in a village, but it very quickly takes it to much darker, much more unexpected places, to the point where, you know, the moment in a JRPG when your hero kind of leaves the village and goes off on an adventure is like in most JRPGs is like a really upbeat moment, or not, maybe not upbeat, but it's like the start of an adventure, and there's like there's possibility in the air. Xenogears has your character leaving their village and almost basically committing suicide, and I mean, as soon as you see, basically, once you get through the first hour of Xenogears, you will know whether it's for you or not, because you will either be just completely gripped and emotionally traumatized, or you'll just be like, no, this is not like the game for me. But yeah, it basically upends a lot of RPG traditions, and it does that thing of that all RPGs do, where it makes you and your party feel like they're incredibly powerful and important people in this world. And then Xenogears is unique in that it then does something that makes you feel like the tiniest of ants in the entire cosmos. And there's this moment where it like pans back, and the picture is suddenly so much bigger than you ever could have comprehended. And that's kind of the genius of this game, is just its scale and its scope, and just how ridiculously ambitious it is. So it's an RPG if you want to try something different and a little bit messed up, I guess.
And
that was a very long elevator ride.
It's definitely a fine elevator pitch in terms of length. It's certainly shorter than the last episode I recorded before this, anyways. And I'll touch back upon the ambition and scope of Xenoblade. Dear God, this is going to be a long episode, especially with everything Xeno now. You'll see why when we get to it. But yeah. It's going to be a long episode. But we'll come back to the ambition and scope of Xenogears in a minute. But I want to touch upon something that actually you mentioned before we started recording, and actually something I found out. And that is that Xenogears was actually originally concepted by Tetsuya Takahashi as a pitch for Final Fantasy VII.
That's right, yes. So Tetsuya Takahashi was the art director on Final Fantasy VI, and a few other of the earlier Final Fantasies before that. And he got... and there was this other person that worked at Square Enix called Soraya Saga, and she worked on Final Fantasy VI as an artist, and I believe an artist, and also did some of the character design, came up with the characters of Edgar and Saban, I think. Tetsuya Takahashi and Soraya Saga ended up getting married, and they came up with this concept for... basically Square Enix at that point didn't really know what Final Fantasy VII was going to be, and they had a couple of ideas, and they were generally they opened it up to the company and said, look, if anyone's got any pitches for what Final Fantasy VII could be, we want to hear them. So Takahashi and Soraya Saga had been thinking of this idea for a while. I believe it started as Soraya Saga's idea about something about somebody giving birth to mankind, and then Tetsuya Takahashi took it and kind of expanded it, and they worked on it together. And they proposed it as a proposition for Final Fantasy VII to Hironobu Sakaguchi, the head of development at Square Enix at that point, and he said that it was just too dark, to be a Final Fantasy. It was it's very science fiction orientated, and very dark. And he said, "Look, it's not right for a Final Fantasy, but how would you feel about starting up a new team and having it be your directorial debut?" And so Takahashi was like, "Yeah." So I believe the team was largely made up of the team that had just finished Chrono Trigger, so they started working on Xenogears, and I think it was like a 2-year development, nothing particularly crazy for the time, but yeah, like it's interesting when the game and you think, yeah, it would be far too dark for a Final Fantasy game, but it's a testament to how Square operated at the time, that anybody who had a good idea for something could just start up a team and make another JRPG. In those days, there was so much less risk on the line that they could take so many more chances.
Like, say today, would that be able to work as a Final Fantasy game, like a hypothetical numbered Final Fantasy game, even 16?
Well, can Xenogears be Final Fantasy 16? Possibly. I mean, the series has always changed over time, but I think it would probably still be seen as a bit too sci-fi, and maybe a bit too psychologically orientated. Maybe it does still feel quite different from Final Fantasy. It was kind of given the opportunity to have its own identity, and I don't know if it would fit in Final Fantasy, because it's not afraid of doing some things that might turn you off if you're like somebody who just wants to play a generic JRPG, if you see what I mean.
The second point of it being maybe too psychological, I can kind of get for sure, but like I think even with Final Fantasy, it's kind of gotten even in itself a little sci-fi now, even with stuff like 8 and even to a lesser extent 13.
Yeah, that's very true. I think, it did definitely go in a sci-fi direction anyway. 7 was definitely the start of that, with Midgar and being that kind of massive dystopian city kind of thing. I think it's because Xenogears, a large part of Xenogears is focused on these gigantic robots that the player has, which are the gears of the title. They're called gears, and so I think the fact that you are quite often fighting in a giant robot, and there's a lot of flying through the air, and I don't know. I do know what you're saying, but at the same time, it's kind of like a different kind of sci-fi. Takahashi has always been kind of obsessed with like Gundam and those kind of robot animes, and it basically is a robot anime. I mean, a lot of people at the time compared it to Evangelion, Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Yes.
Which it does have quite a lot of similarities to. They came out like quite around the same time-ish, I think. But yeah, it's that kind of thing. It's like they took something like a normal robot anime and then did, some much darker, introspective things with it. Really, I guess you could say that Xenogears is the Evangelion of JRPGs, in that it's a bit too complex for its own good. It's obsessed with Christianity. All of its characters have mental breakdowns. There's quite a lot of similarities. Yeah.
So, just to touch back on something that, excuse me, to touch back on something that you said earlier. Like, you said it was extremely ambitious with an insane scope. Like, compared to other JRPGs at the time, compare and contrast basically on how that was with Xenogears compared to any other JRPG at the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, JRPGs at the time had massive. They all had crazy scope, right? Like if you look back at how much stuff there was in Final Fantasy VII, you're just like, what? Which is why they're cutting it up into smaller bits to remake it, because you just couldn't make a game that that dense anymore. I don't know. I think the thing with Xenogears is that you constantly think that it's building towards an end, and then it will it pulls back a curtain that had completely surrounded you, and suddenly you realise that there's so much else going on, and then it will do that again, and then it will do that again. I think just to do the main story of Xenogears is about 50 hours. And all of its characters have pretty deep, its characters have their own stories going on that nowadays we would put into side quests or something like that. But in those days it was no, everything is part of the main story. And the reason I say the scope is kind of crazy because the first 25 hours of the game is almost inconsequential to the next 25 hours of the game because, well, not inconsequential, but you just realize just how much bigger everything gets. It's a really hard thing to describe, but basically it's so big that they ran out of money and time, so it's on 2 discs. Disc 1 is about 35 hours, and then disc 2. This is quite interesting actually because somebody asked Tetsuya Takahashi about this recently because he's doing the publicity circuit for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and he said that they basically completely ran out of money, and Square said that they would have to end it at the end of disc 1, which by most game standards would have been a nice kind of it would have been a good resolution. You would have felt like you'd achieved something and stopped, saved the day and all that kind of stuff. But he was no, that's not the story. The story has to, go back to the beginning of time and go towards the end of time. It has to encompass everything. So disc 2 is almost entirely the characters sat in rocking chairs, narrating what you should have been playing. So they'd go then they went to this dungeon and this happened, and then we went to this dungeon and this happened, and then it's just like a text adventure, with the core bosses. They must have done the bosses already, so the bosses are there. But yeah, they'll just talk for 10 minutes about places they went and things they did, and then you'll fight a boss randomly, and then they'll talk again. So yeah, it kind of disintegrates, which a lot of people don't like. I never had any problem with it because I was so invested with the story that I was hey, I'm getting concentrated story. I have no problem with this. And they did it in a very kind of way that fit in with the rest of the game. But yeah, it's basically for the first to try and answer the question that you asked me in a succinct manner, the first 25 hours of the game-ish are about a war between 2 nations, and yeah, you get really involved in that, and you have a side, and you are kind of fighting against this other side and stopping them from taking you over, and then there are these other countries that are getting involved, these aerial kingdoms that are getting involved on both sides. And it's this kind of political intrigue stuff going on. And that's really great. But then at the end of that 25 hours, it's do you know how inconsequential it is that for 10 years these countries have been fighting? It's hell no. Now this story is going to be about the 10,000 years that happened before and how your character has been there since the beginning of time. And, the way it expands is just crazy. It's such a rush to kind of experience it because it's suddenly everything you think is just doesn't really matter at all. And that could be quite annoying to be well, I've just spent all this time doing this. But it's the kind of because one of the key themes of Xenogears is the recurrence of the souls. So it's about kind of being reborn again and again. And you kind of come to realize that your characters have been born in similar guises throughout previous eras of history, right back to the moment of creation. And you kind of realize who the real bad guy is, essentially. And just that kind of, the way it suddenly expands like that was just like really intoxicating. And they planned and at the end of Xenogears, it does that kind of Star Wars thing by going, this was episode 5. And then they did a book afterwards that kind of explained that there were these, like, Xenogears was one part of a 6-part story. And there were like, there were 4 before it, which the game kind of touches upon, but there's far more to go into it. There's one far before the game even starts, and then one after the game. So the idea was that they would, after the game was released, they would start making games, or they made a novel of one of the episodes, I think. But the game didn't end up selling enough to get a sequel, which is why Takahashi ended up leaving Square Enix in the end.
Xenogears had this combination of sort of, and do correct me if I'm wrong here, it had a combination of real-time battles, with Square Enix's active time battle system. I think it was the first game. No, sorry, it wasn't the first game that would have been used, that have used it outside Final Fantasy. But it used it in an interesting way, a sort of rather than kind of sword-based combat or stuff like that. There was sort of martial arts combat. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. Yeah, so it's kind of an evolution of, I guess in some ways it's an evolution of Chrono Trigger's battle system, because I think it was the same designers, and Chrono Trigger itself was an evolution of Final Fantasy's battle system. So it is turn-based, but rather than just selecting attack or defend or magic or whatever, you when you chose to attack, you had 3 different strengths of attack, almost like Street Fighter. You had a weak attack, medium attack, and a strong attack. And you had a certain number of a certain amount of action points or something that would determine how many things you could do. So you might do a weak attack and then a strong attack if you had 4 action points or whatever, or you might do 2 medium attacks or whatever. But they could basically, as you went through the game, you learned combos, just again like a fighting game. That you would put in, and then they would do these kind of crazy martial arts, spinning around and picking people up and throwing them, and all sorts of kind of craziness. So yeah, there was an element of martial arts in it, and then as well as that, there was a whole nother battle system for when you were in the robots, where you had a similar light, medium, strong attack. I think it's been a while. But you had this fuel gauge that you would have to recharge and make sure you weren't using too much of or whatever. So it was kind of crazy in that it had 2 really massively deep battle systems, depending on whether you were on foot or whether you were in the gears. So there was a lot of stuff. The battle system was really, really great. It really did feel like it had its own flavor and its own identity away from Final Fantasy. And it's strange that martial arts was such a big part of it, because it's not really a part of the game at all, apart from the fact that most of them use martial arts. Some of them do use weapons, I think. Some of the characters. Billy uses a gun. Billy the priest uses a gun.
That sounds so jarring when you put it like that.
Yes. Yeah, it really is. But Billy's... we'll have to get onto Billy in a bit, but But yeah, I think the main characters Faye and Saitan, who's called Shitan in the Japanese version, which they had to change. Yeah, which obvious, being about 14 at the time, I thought was hilarious. It was called Shitan.
We're still children now.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I can't pretend to have grown up. Yeah, but yeah, Xenogears was like a very strange game in that it really tried to have a lot of messages about real life in it. So as well as characters going through like real, well, actually, I was going to say characters going through real mental disorders. That's absolutely not true, because the main character has multiple personality disorder, and his other personality is like a devil. So that's not how multiple personality disorder works at all. So to claim it is would be quite ridiculous of me. But yeah, like it has a lot of stuff about the real world in it, and I remember reading an interview with Takahashi, and he said like at the time he feels very differently now because of how games have changed and matured and all of that. But at the time, he really wanted to put messages about the real world and about how almost like how to live better, I guess, in the games. And the reason he put them in the games is because he felt like if he just went up to people, the people who would play the game and just said these things, they would be like, why are you preaching at me? Like, who are you? Like, what's going on? But if he wrote characters who were in those situations and found out those answers for themselves, then he would be able to get that message across to people in a more natural way. And it really, it was surprisingly effective. I mean, so as I was just saying with Billy's a character who's a priest in the main religion in the world of Xenogears. And he, so that religion is called the Ethos in the English version, but in the Japanese version it's just called the Church, which they had to change because it was very obviously the Catholic Church. And they made, in the Japanese version, they make no effort to essentially say that it isn't, basically just the Catholic Church. So yeah, it was one of the things that got changed in the English version. But there's some pretty dodgy stuff in there. But one of the things is that through the course of the game is that you kind of learn that the religion is a lie, and was created as a tool to manipulate people into an end game, which some people would say about real religion or whatever. But you've got this character in your party who is like a devout member of that faith. And he basically kind of undergoes a big crisis of confidence because he's, everything I've dedicated my life to, I've just found out is a lie. I have no idea what to kind of do with my life now. And then he's in his giant robot, and his dad comes along in another robot that's shaped like a bullet. And his dad, saying it now, it's just so bizarre. But his dad comes along, and his dad gives him this speech about, religion isn't something that people tell you. Religion is what you believe yourself. It's not. You have to come up with the answers yourself. You don't just take what other people say and just go by that. You have to work things out for yourself. You have to question things yourself. You have to find out what your true spirituality is as a person, and use that as your force to go forward, not just what someone else says. And that's the kind of moment that rejuvenates him as a character, because he realizes he can almost still be a religious person in a world that now has no religion in it, because it's not about what other people say. It's about him doing what he thinks is right, and him following his own code of ethics, in a way. And then his dad transforms fully into a bullet, and then Billy puts the bullet in his gigantic gun and then fires him at a boss that you couldn't kill, and then his dad dies. So it's a really like, it makes no sense at all. And I remember I did a talk about this at a literary festival in London, and there was a night about game criticism, or like reading out game essays, and I did the story about the man in the bullet, because at the time I was playing the game, I had at the time I was playing the game, I had just become okay with the idea that I was a gay man, and I, as part of that, as somebody who was kind of grew up in a Christian household, although not a very strong one, but I went to a school where we had church services every week that we had to go to. And I can't imagine how many times I've recited the Lord's Prayer and all that kind of stuff. Because I'd just come to the point where I was beginning to be okay with my sexuality, I rebelled against religion, which I think a lot of gay or queer people do, because they see religion as something that, that explicitly thinks you're wrong, if you take it literally. And so it's the first thing that I rebelled against. I was like, I'm not going to do those prayers in school anymore. I don't care about religion, and that's complete bullshit. And I don't want anything to do with it. And, fuck them or whatever. And then I played this game, and the moment that I saw that scene, that unbelievably ridiculous scene where a man did a suicide in a bullet, it changed my outlook completely. I was just sat there not really expecting to have a massive life epiphany that day, but listening to the character say that, I suddenly realized that just because I didn't want to be a part of a religion that thought I was wrong, or that there was something wrong with me that I wasn't admitting, didn't mean that I couldn't be a religious or spiritual person. And it actually, it was a huge moment for me, because it made me, it made me open my mind again, because I deliberately closed my mind off, and being like, I'm going to be an atheist, whatever. Religion is evil, and it made me kind of reassess my viewpoint and go, you know what? It's not about religion being a bad thing, although it can be a bad thing. Religion can also be a good thing, and more importantly, you should always keep on questioning yourself and what's going on around you. And a lot of the other religious parts of Xenogears is very much based around Gnosticism. Really kind of sparked my interest in Gnosticism, and I ended up buying a lot of books about it and reading it, and basically subscribing to that worldview in my own way, and that the earth is kind of messed up, but the God that it says, the God that claims to rule this earth is not necessarily a very good God, and is kind of deceiving us from the truth. And and I ended up it basically kickstarted a journey that ended up with me becoming a member of a Unitarian church when I moved to London, and finding a lot of happiness and a sense of belonging through that, which I would never have had if I'd not played Xenogears, if I hadn't had that moment that opened my mind. So that's kind of one of the reasons that Xenogears will always be my favorite game, because it actually literally changed my life. and made me re-examine things in a much broader, a much more mature way, really.
I think it's insane when you put it like that. I mean, like, it's kind of hard to kind of quantify that in a way with a question, but I don't ever recall games doing religion on a near kind of main focal point of the game. Like,
no,
not until recently, anyways, with Nier Automata, anyways, like, for sure. But other than that, and Xenogears, you don't really expect games to kind of give you those kind of life epitomes.
Yeah.
And at least until recently, but I think that's kind of why games have matured so much in the past, 20 or so years since Xenogears came out, and it's insane that now that we have these games that can deal with these mature issues, like religion, like mental health, like sexuality. It's insane.
Also Xenogears is the first, I think, and probably the only JRPG where there's a love interest between between the main male and main female characters. They have sex, which I remember being like, blimey. I mean, you don't like see it, but it's very obvious that it happens. And I remember, like, before that, JRPGs were so like chaste, and they still are in a lot of ways, and innocent. And this was a game that was just like, no, let's deal with things. To me, Xenogears is what an actual mature game is. Do you know what I mean? Like, not mature as in, oh, it's full of blood and violence or whatever, but as in, it's not afraid to say things about the real world.
Like it's mature in its themes, not so much mature in its kind of showing of this is for mature people or stuff like that. It's just basically mature themes.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that's something that, like you say with Nier, with Yoko Taro, he is very much, even though he writes these insanely fantastical, strange games, he is very keen on reflecting the real world in the games that he does, which is why Nier is still Nier, and his games are still some of the only Japanese games that have gay characters in them, and that try to say a lot about how we are as humans now, even though they're not set in the now.
I'll come back on the Nier Automata like way later on, but just to jump back into Xenogears and literally onto like the final 5 letters of that name, Gears.
Yes.
I think Gears are perhaps I think Takahashi has a bit of an obsession with Gears now, going by Xenogears and Xenoblade in a way.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea with Xeno was that it was always going to be a story about something outside the norm, and that's obviously what Xeno means, outside. And Xeno is the thing that's carried, that he's carried basically as his brand from Xenogears. Then he left Square Enix and started up Monolith Soft, which originally was part of Namco. And that's when he started the Xenosaga games, which originally was going to be 6 games, just like the 6 episodes of Xenogears, and was like a spiritual remake. Not remake, but kind of
prequel.
Imagining. In some ways, yeah, like it started at episode 1, where obviously Xenogears had started at episode 5, and it wasn't going to be exactly the same, but it was the same themes, the same type of thing. But again, just far, far, far too ambitious. They made 3 40-hour RPGs and only made it to about halfway through episode 2's worth of story. and he ended up having to leave the project, and and Soraya Saga wrote the script for the first one, and then was unceremoniously dumped from the series after that. It was a big to do at the time, I remember. And then so he did those. That series got ended after 3 games. Then Nintendo bought Monolith Soft, and he started on Xenoblade, and again bit off far more than he could chew, really, because Xenoblade is the first one is a huge game. It has a main story that is at least 45-50 hours long, plus a gigantic open world full of side quests and ridiculous things. But there was an interesting thing in an interview he did in one of those old Iwata Asks interviews they used to do, that were amazing, where he said that basically in every game he'd made previously, he'd got to the halfway point and then had to give up because of circumstances. And he got to that point with Xenoblade Chronicles. He got to that point in the middle when it just seemed like it was this gigantic thing, and there was no way they were going to be able to do it. And they went to Nintendo and were like, "We just don't. We're going to have to cut loads of it." And Nintendo was like, "No, you're gonna see this through. This is going to be the one where you actually get to the end of what you want to achieve." And it's kind of been that way since, with then Xenoblade Chronicles X, although I don't know what happened with that game in a lot of ways. And yeah, now Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which is out in a few weeks.
Yeah, about 2 weeks' time as of recording this, anyways.
As of recording, yeah.
But yeah.
And finally, Soraya Saga has been allowed back to do something. She's only done one character design for one of the Blade characters, but it's so good to have her back, because she is one of the people I look up to most in the games industry, because I feel like she wrote really, really good female characters, and I think she wrote at least one incredible mother character as well. And I think that's really, I think we've got to a point in games now where we value the diversity in terms of people that are making games, because we want diverse stories. And I think this happened in Xenogears, and this happened in Xenosaga Episode 1, where you have this mother character who has a really great arc about coming to terms with something about her child that I don't feel like it could have been written by someone who wasn't a mother. And then I feel like they were really ahead of the curve, and then she got discarded. And it's been, and I think that's just such a shame. And I know she's doing some things now, but she's very secretive about what they are. She follows me on Twitter, and we do talk occasionally. She's lovely, but she's very secretive and reserved now, after a lot of stuff that happened. But it's only because of her that we know so much about Xenogears and Xenosaga and how they were made. She's the only one who's ever really spoken about them. It's because of her we know that it was originally the Final Fantasy VII game and stuff like that. So she's a voice that I really want heard again, because I really think she has a lot of unique viewpoints and experiences to draw upon.
So that brings us to the kind of overworld and character building then of Xenogears, and how was that something that you found anyways?
It's the level of detail is insane. So they released this book afterwards called Perfect Works, which is it's part art book, but it's mostly like a background setting book, and just the amount of effort they went into about, because the game takes place over 10,000 years of history, and the amount of effort they went into dealing with things like how the people evolved, how creatures evolved, how the societies and religions evolved. There's like the most insane amount. I've never ever seen world building more detailed. Like the level of detail is just incredible. There's just like hundreds of pages of dense information about these civilizations and people and creatures and how the monsters evolved, and all just so much detail. And a lot of it really comes through in the game, but it's when you look at that book and you see just how insane they went, and you see all of the events of the game plotted out and how much it takes, and there's pages and pages about just what happens in the intro and explaining the biochemistry of how organic computing could work, and all just like insane levels of detail. And that now is Takahashi's trademark. They did it again on Xenosaga. Xenosaga, again, like the super spiritual prequel, takes place in a galaxy full of these planets with different civilizations and full of different people, and just it's like I always said that Xenosaga was the most detailed universe I'd seen since like Star Wars. It was kind of that insane level of detail, even though so much of it wasn't being shown. So yeah, that's kind of his trademark now, and it's something they've tried to carry on. I think with less, personally, with less success. Certainly with Xenoblade Chronicles X, just felt very not like that at all. I don't know what happened with that game, but
I can really remember feeling way too overwhelmed with X. So
yeah, it's like I feel like there probably was a lot of stuff there, but it's just none of it. It's explained well, and it's crazy. But I was reading something about Xenoblade Chronicles 2 that one of the writers wrote on the official website, and they were saying one of the things they said is like we were absolutely dedicated on making it a very Takahashi style game, and by that we mean a ridiculous density of world building. So that's his trademark really, and yeah, Xenogears, to have like 10,000 years of history and a lot of which, as you can see in game even, is just like insane.
I want to touch upon Takahashi himself and Soraya Saga, and like the work they've done together. Obviously they've gotten married, but like especially the work they've done. Like you mentioned how Saga is basically one of your biggest inspirations.
Yes.
And Takahashi himself like has gone on to build these kind of ambitious, filled with scope games like Xenogears, like with Xenosaga as well, and with Xenoblade. And I just want to ask, even now, how much of an impact have they kind of left within the JRPG genre, do you think?
It's really, in some ways I don't think it's been enough, and in other ways I feel like now is when they are finally being...
You're finally getting their due.
Yeah. Xenoblade was definitely the point at which everyone was just like, this game is incredible. And I was like, I know, hello. I've been trying... it's the same thing I've had with Nier Automata, where I've just been like, hello! It's been like this for a while. Yeah, I mean, Xenogears, I don't think that many people... it didn't... Not really enough people played it to have a massive impact. Xenosaga... You see, the thing with Xenosaga is that they went in... Xenogears is full of cutscenes, but Xenosaga, each 40-hour game has about 8 hours of cutscenes in it. So it's like Kojima density of cutscenes. It's just insanity. And I think a lot of people looked at that and were like, oh no, that's what we don't want to do. in a lot of ways, and they learned that now as well. Like Soraya Saga says now that they've learned they needed to be a lot better about the balancing of gameplay and story exposition, you know, and how they can't always be separate things. So I think Xenosaga almost is like, it was like a cautionary tale in some ways about ambition and maybe not going on the right path. But yeah, now I mean to me, Xenoblade is the pinnacle of open world JRPGs at least, and one of the best open world RPGs I think in general. Certainly in terms of visual design, with Xenoblade, every area has something that makes you catch your breath in how beautiful it is, even when it was running on the Wii and looked disgusting. Just the imagination of the area, because the concept of it being set on these two dead giant gods and you're on their skin, and how that played with being able to see these things in the distance and other parts of the body, and it just had such a wonderful concept, and I hope that's had more of an impact. I certainly think it's the example of how open world JRPGs could and should be. It's not perfect, but I think it probably had an impact with I would be very surprised if Square Enix hadn't referenced it, when they were doing Final Fantasy 15, when they were trying their first open world game. In a lot of senses, you play Final Fantasy 15, and you're like, this is really good, but you do realize that Xenoblade did this on the Wii 5 years ago and did it a bit better. So yeah, I think nowadays I feel like Takahashi has a lot more of a kind of a stature, particularly in Japan. Whenever I remember when I was working on Heaven's Strike Rivals and dealing with Square Enix, I think I remember mentioning to the guy who was our producer that Xenogears was my favorite game of all time, and he was like, "Really?" Kind of surprised, because it had been not a massive, not a failure, but not a massive success for them. So I think to hear that there was somebody in England who adored that game was a bit weird, which I think is probably why Square Enix have never done anything with it. Partly that, and also partly because I think it's so personal to Takahashi and Saga that I don't think you could remake it. I think it would just be, it wouldn't be the same. I remember writing a pitch to remake it that I never did anything with. I never even presented it to anyone, but I remember doing it when the 3DS came out, because I was like, you could do Xenogears on this. But even I was like, oh, I love this game, but I don't think I could do it. It's just so personal to them that what I would do wouldn't be Xenogears, even though I have my own list of things I would want to do and bits I would want to cut and bits I would want to add back in and bits I'd want to rejig, and so much that I feel like I could do to it. I don't think I would dare. It's it holds such a special place in the hearts of the people that played it, that I think it would be crazy.
Let me pose you a kind of hypothetical question. So the past, trying to think how many games it's been now. So the past 5 Final Fantasy games have all been done by Kitase, Tanaka, Ito, but that was only after Matsuda left, Toriyama, Tanaka again, and then with Yoshida with 14 when that was relaunched as A Realm Reborn, and then Tabata for 15, and obviously the speculation is maybe Ito for 16. But hypothetical is, do you think that maybe, just maybe, that Takahashi would have done justice to a numbered Final Fantasy game if he had stuck around and was handpicked to be a director of one?
That's that's a very interesting question. I've never thought about that, actually. I think he probably wouldn't be precious enough with what... Yeah, I don't think he'd want to be constrained by... Because there's this very nebulous idea of what makes a Final Fantasy, you know. And I think, in Square Enix, in some ways, I think even struggles with that a little bit. You know, they have a committee now, which they've talked about, that kind of, that's like Yoshida, Tabata, Kitase and Toriyama, I think, who are...
And Nomura, I would assume, as well.
Oh, so yeah, it might be Nomura instead of Toriyama. Who are kind of the custodians of what Final Fantasy is or where it goes. And yeah, I don't know if he would want to fit into that. I think he seems to have very strong visions for things, very strong ideas, very strong concepts, and I don't know if he would want to be, if he would want to really, really like not do what he wanted to do. I think maybe, if he had been given the chance to do a game and was now part of that committee, it would be really interesting because he does have very different tastes to, the other games. They're much more mecha, focused, and certainly Xenoblade, and it looks like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 are quite anime inspired in terms of the kind of just the feeling of them, and they feel a bit more like Saturday morning cartoons, which I think Final Fantasy stopped being a long time ago. But yeah, I mean, I love the fact that that Final Fantasy committee is broader now, like that it has Yoshida and Tabata, who I think did incredible things with their games, and really, I think they have a very strong idea. Also, have very strong ideas of what makes a Final Fantasy game. So, yeah, it would be great to have Takahashi in that mix as well. But yeah, like I say, in some ways, I feel like Takahashi has made some mistakes in what he's done, but I think I'm glad he's made them in some ways. Like he wouldn't be where he was now if he hadn't done a lot of the things that happened in the past. And yeah, it's a difficult one, but yeah, I think we're probably better off that he's not. I think Nintendo give him a lot of freedom and a lot of leeway to kind of do things that he wants to do, and the things he does nowadays are a lot lighter-hearted and not nearly as dark as Xenogears was, and as weighty as Xenosaga tried to be. So yeah, I don't know if he would have ever developed that style without being away from Final Fantasy, if you know what I mean.
No, I totally get it. It would be a really interesting what if though scenario. Yeah,
it absolutely would. It would be interesting to see what the pressures of working on Square's biggest franchise does to your vision and to your eagerness or trepidation towards taking risks, I think. Whereas I feel like Takahashi has taken a lot of risks, and a lot of the times they haven't really worked out. And he may never have taken those if he'd had the pressure of Square's financial future on him.
Like that kind of that kind of albatross in a sense, like which I think is where where Tabata has done really well, in that he managed to make something that felt very distinct from other Final Fantasy games, especially considering when that project in itself had its own issues, when it was Nomura directing, and when it was Versus 13 as well, to an extent.
Yeah. I mean, I cannot wait for the day when we find out what actually happened to all of that, because it feels like there's so much interesting stuff that went on back then. But yeah, like the fact that he was able to take over something, rework it, and get it out in 3.5 years, and really, a lot of people. I think the thing with 15 is that a lot of people don't like what he tried to do. They don't like the road trip thing. Whereas the thing you can't disagree with about 15 is that they executed that road trip thing basically perfectly, as well as they could have. And whether people like the game or not is whether they like the idea of that road trip. But in terms of like achieving what you aim for, I think they basically got it dead on. That they wanted it to feel like a road trip. They wanted you to feel the connection between those 4 characters. And that's the thing the game does really well. Beyond that, everyone has their different opinions of how well it does. But those 4 characters are drawn so well. That, yeah, I think personally, I think 15 was a great achievement. But I understand that there will always be people that don't think that. But that's Final Fantasy fandom for you. You can never agree on anything.
Other than our super serious radical hate of 13, maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Even though I'd rather play 13 than 8, but, that's a whole other story.
Fair enough. Although, to be fair, I'd probably chuck 13 in a fire, but that's a different story for another day.
Yeah.
So, what about, especially, just to jump completely back into Xenogears, and the soundtrack, especially from Yasunori Matsuda, like how was that for you, especially in terms of a game that scope and that ambition?
Divine, I think, is the only word I could say to describe it. It's like, I was just so blown away by it because it's just so strong. And I think Mitsuda said at the time that he felt like what he wanted to do was create these incredibly strong melodies that maybe nowadays he wouldn't, because they might be a bit repetitive or something. But it just worked so incredibly well. It's a very Mitsuda has developed a reputation for like a very I don't want to say world, I want to say almost say ethnic kind of approach to composition, where his games have a lot of the feels of different cultures in them in his music, and Xenogears is very much the start of that. Because he took a lot of inspiration from, that's where he kind of from Celtic music especially. He took a lot of inspiration from that. In fact, the theme tune to Xenogears, which I believe was the first Square Enix game to have a vocal end song, because they got there before Final Fantasy VIII did. That was actually recorded in Ireland. And has mostly Irish musicians on it, and the singer is an Irish singer called Joanne Hogg from Iona, I think, who were at one point a fairly well-known like Celtic folk band, and yeah, it's like really crazy. There's also a song which is a Bulgarian choir, which he literally went to Bulgaria to record. But that's like, if you've ever heard any of this kind of Bulgarian choir kind of almost like wailing voices, it's this like incredibly overbearing, like very spiritual kind of music kind of sound, and it plays in the game at the moment where you finally meet you finally meet God. You finally meet the god, what amounts for a god in Xenogears, the true god, the one true, wave existence, as he's called. And it just fits that so perfectly because it's this kind of, this Bulgarian chant that's kind of beautiful, but also slightly scary at the same time, and full of kind of wonder, and it just encapsulates that what it would be like to meet God, being like terrified in some ways and incredibly curious and feeling love, I guess, that you would feel if you met your creator. And it amounts to that perfectly, but I've never heard anything like it in a game ever since then. That was Mitsuda's thing, was about, different cultures and taking the instruments from local music in different countries and kind of combining that together to give a game a feeling of being in another world. That was, Chrono Trigger he did before that, and Chrono Trigger's soundtrack is incredible. And Chrono Trigger does have some elements of world music in it as well, actually, to be quite fair. But I think Xenogears is where it really becomes a thing, and then he takes that into Chrono Cross, which was the game that team, minus Takahashi and minus the people that left, did next, which has an incredible, like, tropical sound to it, which is just insane. But yeah, again, like, very much an evolution of what he started and what he really did with Xenogears.
What else do you like about Xenogears that we've not touched upon tonight?
Oh God, I don't know. It's just it's that mix of really stupid. It's, like I said when I did this talk at this literary festival, Xenogears is a game that is kind of almost not scared to be a game and to be ridiculous in it. So it has these ridiculous moments where you're in a giant robot and you're squaring off against a giant walking tank and on the back of a air carrier in the middle of the sky, and it's just like, it makes no sense and it's stupid, and then it will be really serious, and then it will be really dark, and then there's a character, one of the party characters is just a pink ball of fur that just is adorable, and there's a moment where he becomes the size of a house, which makes no sense at all. Yeah, that's right, because everybody has a gear. Everyone in the character has a gear that they can ride in, and then you get Choo Choo, and you're like, well, how is he going to have a robot? No, he just grows to the size of a robot. So he is this giant sphere with an adorable face that is like taking on these massive evil robots, and like it's just that perfect mix of like I was saying earlier, maturity, but also that ridiculousness of robot anime, I don't know, like there are quite a few bad bits of the game. I've never managed to play it through again. I've tried quite a few times, and I've always got up to certain points and then quit because there's particularly difficult dungeons, or there's that one bit where when you're a prisoner in Kislev that goes on for like 5 hours, and you're like, Jesus Christ, like there's so much else you could be doing right now, but we're in some weird battling league in order to get bomb collars taken off our necks, and it's just there's a talking rat. I forgot about the talking rat. Yeah, it's just everything. That game is everything, and I can very much imagine that a lot of people would play it and just go, this is a complete mess. But I think if you can see what it is, it's just wonderful. That's all I can really say.
What didn't you like about it?
So yeah, like I said, there are some areas where the game slows down, And the thing is that there's so much story in the game that it doesn't need to slow down, but there are just these moments where you're doing this stuff, and it doesn't feel really slower than any other game, but it's just when you know the true scope of the game and what's going on, you just think, well, why couldn't we have done a bit less there and not had some of the bits later on that were cut and replaced by, people rocking in rocking chairs, like they're going mad. And it's very difficult, like a lot of the games of that time, a lot of the RPGs of that time, is quite tough, and it can really hand it to you. But that's about it. I mean, I don't know. Like if I could go back and remake it, I think I would just try and pace things a little bit better and cut out some unnecessary bits so that some of the other more necessary bits don't get glossed over at the end. I think most people would point to Disc 2 and say Disc 2 is boring, but if you're invested in the story by that point, then Disc 2 is like crack, especially as for a lot of the game, a lot of the latter half of Disc 1 you spend inside the characters' minds anyway. So to have them rocking in space, talking about stuff that happens doesn't feel weird at all. It's just like, oh yeah, okay. They're talking about things that might have happened, and there's a giant cross swinging in the background. But that's just normal.
What would you change from a design perspective in terms of the game itself?
I don't think I'd change anything. Oh, do you know what I would do? I've just remembered there are some terrible platforming bits. Do you remember when a lot of games that weren't platformers had platforming bits in them?
Yeah.
And you were just like, this game is not meant to be a platformer.
Yeah.
It's really hard. There's one notorious bit in the Tower of Babel where you have to climb the tower, and you're doing it by jumping on rocks, and you just keep on slipping and falling all the way down, and you have to start again, and you're just like, why? So I'd probably I would get rid of the jumping. I'd probably just get rid of the jumping full stop. Take the jump button out. But aside from that, the battle system is so good. I honestly wouldn't change anything about it. Like I say, the story and the stuff I would rearrange a bit, but yeah, the design of it, I'd make it a bit easier, I think, as well, because some of the bosses are just like a bit of a kind of gate, and I remember some of them I had to do so many times. I never finished the game because the last boss was too hard. So I had to watch the ending on YouTube many years later. I just didn't know how it ended for a long time. So yeah, they're just little bits, but no, Xenogears is actually the closest. I think it's the closest thing to perfection that Takahashi has done. So yeah, I really wouldn't change a huge amount at all.
What would you say is the moment in Xenogears that it became your favourite game?
Do you know what? I can't remember. I was trying to think about this earlier, and I can't actually remember exactly what the moment is. But it's the moment where where it's like the pan back on the camera, and you suddenly realise how big things are. You start to piece together the puzzle that it's been hinting at for ages, and that's just a mind-boggling thing, because you're just like, God, the things we were doing as a party before were so trivial compared to what we're doing now, where we're trying to yeah, I think that's it. There's a particular moment towards the end of the game, in which, obviously, spoiler alert, but I've been spoiling everything throughout here anyway, in which there's a bit, towards the end of the game where 90% of the people on Earth die. That was the moment where I was like, ho. Like, I already knew by that point that this was very much a game for me, but that was the point where I was like, wow, you cannot predict where this is going to go at all, and that's a very exciting thing. That's a very exciting position to put a player in, where they're just shocked by things that are happening. That's great, and very rare.
That kind of grim predicament.
Yeah, or just the fact that oh my god, they went there. Like they're just where games hint about things, or like, oh, something really bad's going to happen, but no, you saved the day, and it's like, no, 90% of the world people in the world died, and it's also kind of your fault. But you still got to go on, and then you go back and you find the survivors, and they're all just like, you're a dick, and you're kind of like, yep. Well, no, I don't know if they're really like that. Actually, looking back, they're not. I mean, it's only partially your fault, but it's still very much, you do feel a sense of responsibility for it. Again, which I think is something that Yoko Taro does really well in his games. Just taking you beyond where you'd normally go. Just really escalating things to the next level.
Obviously, there was no kind of follow-on from Xenogears, but there were Xeno games. So let's say top 3 Xeno games. How would you rank them? Obviously, Xenogears at the top, but like in terms of Xenosaga or Xenoblade, how would you rank them?
I'd probably say Xenogears at the top. Obviously. Xenoblade second, probably, because it's very complete. I mean, I didn't finish it because it was so long, and I do really regret that, and I'm desperate for them to do an HD remaster of it at some point, which they really should do. And then for the third one, well, it wouldn't be X. Mm-hmm. Definitely wouldn't be X. No. So it would be one of the 3 Xenosaga games. Xenosaga Episode 1 struggles by being the first part of a big story, so not really enough happens, especially as they cut so much from it. But it is very Takahashi, and that's great. Xenosaga Episode 2 is just a mess because they decided, because the first Xenosaga sold really well in America, they were like, we're going to change everything. We're going to make it more explosions and more stuff for Americans, and that's why they got rid of Takahashi. He wasn't director anymore, and he was just like original story or something. And it, they redesigned the characters to look awful, and that was a bad point. Xenosaga Episode 3 rectifies a lot of things, but it has to tie up a lot of loose ends that weren't meant to be tied up so quickly, so it's kind of a brain dump. I'd probably say Xenosaga Episode 3, just because to have on, when you've been playing something, you've been playing a series for 90 hours across 5 years, and you've had these mysteries since the beginning, and they're finally, they're finally getting solved. That was a pretty incredible feeling, even if it wasn't, perhaps they weren't solved as well as they should have been. It was pretty crazy, and I cried a lot at the ending of that game. So, to have 5 years of something you're so excited about be over was kind of crazy. Xenosaga Episode 3 would be third.
Your fingertips moving gently to my heart. The force of life goes on and on.
Honorable mentions, go for it.
Okay, so honorable mentions. Well, obviously Final Fantasy VII. You have to say, because Final Fantasy VII, if it hadn't been for Final Fantasy VII, I would have never been able to experience Xenogears, because I never would have known to look for something so obscure, something that didn't even come out in Europe. And what can you say about Final Fantasy VII that hasn't been said? Nothing. But Final Fantasy VII, it just opened my eyes to what games could be. You know, Xenogears further opened them, but Final Fantasy 7 did that heavy lifting the first time, and you know, I still maintain that the first 10 hours of that game are the finest first 10 hours of any RPG ever. I went back and at one point I was studying opening acts, and I played the first like 5 hours of 7 and the first 5 hours of 8, and it's just astonishing how much better the first 5 hours of 7 are. Like, it drops you straight into the action. It keeps on surprising you. It's just crazy. And then you leave Midgar and it's like, now the game starts. You know, like this crazy like shift of, oh yeah, now you've got a world to explore, which, you know, most games would do much earlier and wouldn't make you feel like you'd played a full game before then. So yeah, you know, 7 was the game, you know, it was the game, you know, it was the game where Aeris died, right? That's what everyone remembers, because we didn't really know that could happen before that, right? Had anyone really died in game? I mean, I'm sure people had died in games, but that was the kind of the big one, you know. And still to this day, I still think it's really controversial that they gave you a character that you could control for, you know, 15, 20 hours and then killed her and were like, yeah, sorry, she's not going to be part of it anymore. You know, because I remember people being really pissed off that they'd spent so much money on equipment for her and, you know, and getting her limit breaks and all that stuff. And then the game's like, nope, she's gone. So, it's still to this day is just a benchmark of emotional, you know, emotional moments, and yeah, just again, just such volume to that game. You know, I imagine I would imagine, I have no idea, obviously, but I imagine whatever the first chapter of this 7 remake we're going to get is going to just be Midgar, because Midgar is big enough to sustain a game on its own, you know? And that was just the opening act of 7. So yeah, just, you know, opened my eyes to the fact that games could be emotional, the fact that games could have these long stories, the fact that you would really get a feel of adventuring through a whole world. You know, like, I'd played games like Zelda beforehand, but that kind of almost felt like exploring an area. And 7 was where you felt like you went across an entire globe. You know, like, you went to snowy mountains and deserts and under the sea and into space, and, you know, you really got every part of that world down. So yeah, I mean, the soundtrack, you know, I think that was one of the first times that I loved a game soundtrack. I think the one before that was Street Fighter 2. I remember having a CD of Street Fighter 2 soundtrack somehow. Don't know how.
That was Yoko Shimomura, right?
It was Yoko Shimomura, who went on to do 15, which I think is one of the greatest RPG soundtracks. So to have her having started that from back then is, you know, pretty special. So yeah, everything about 7. It's been talked about so much, sometimes it feels churlish talking about 7, but...
Not to mention that you've actually had 2 actual episodes on 7.
Exactly. They could probably go on about it. They probably have gone on about it far better than I have. So, the other Final Fantasy that I would say gets an honourable mention is 9, which is probably my favourite Final Fantasy, I think. I mean, maybe 7 is my favourite, really, but I don't want to say 7 because it's the obvious answer whenever anyone asks that question, you know. That's actually a question that I ask everybody who starts at Mediatonic. It's the first thing I ask them when everyone does a welcome email. It's like, hey, what's your favourite Final Fantasy? By the way, there are wrong answers to this question. and it always starts a debate, which I love. And yeah, nine to me is different from 7 because it's I mean, not just because of the setting, because it's more medieval, more fantasy, but it also has kind of that old Final Fantasy tone of being a bit more playful, a bit less serious, a bit, quite whimsical, quite big on the physical comedy, which again, 7 was really good at. 7 has a lot of quite funny, quite stupid moments. And one of the reasons I hate 8 is because I feel like it just went up its own arse, and became the super emo game. And 9 to me is the game where you've got the characters have innately funny things about them. Like Vivi has his clumsiness, and Steiner has his... I guess Steiner is like the bumbling knight. He the way his big rusty armor that people keep on saying looks rubbish, and the fact that he's always trying to do right but getting it wrong, and and even like Aiko, the little girl, she's got a real great sassy tongue on her, and Quina, the weird giant frog thing with the massive tongue, who's the traditional Final Fantasy joke character. Her obsession with food and not really understanding social mores is just wonderful. I just think that game, I think story-wise that game has a lot of problems, especially towards the end. But character-wise, I think it's just wonderful. Everyone, they really go through some stuff, but they do it with kind of a wink and a nod, and I think it's the best soundtrack, I think, probably, of a Final Fantasy. I think that's when Nobuo Uematsu was just at the absolute top of his game. Yeah, and it's beautiful, and the world design is gorgeous, and everything about 9 kind of appeals to the slightly, I guess, where 7 appeals to the more almost like steampunky side of things. 9 is like is the best of the traditional Final Fantasy to me. The 1 to 6, the best bits of all of those games put together. So yeah, that would be my other Final Fantasy pick. Chrono Cross, which I touched on earlier, is a game that I think has a lot of problems story-wise, especially towards the end, but has a brilliant opening part, and the most gorgeous visual design of almost any game ever. The way that it's set on these tropical islands, and it just feels like a holiday. The colours are so vibrant, and there's all this crazy vegetation and coral and reefs and these gorgeous seas, and you just want to drink it in. And the music, easily Mitsuda's best soundtrack. It's Chrono Cross, and just how gorgeously like tropical it sounds, and otherworldly, and again, the game has problems, but the battle system's great. The battle system is very much an evolution of Xenogears as one, with the different level attacks and things like that. Chrono Cross has people that really don't like it. I also like how Chrono Cross shits on the game that it's a sequel to, because I think that's a really bold choice to make. It's I'd never played Chrono Trigger when I played Chrono Cross, so I didn't really have that frame of reference, which I think is why people don't like it, is when they come in having loved Trigger. But to have a game that's a sequel and then to basically go, oh yeah, those characters you loved in the previous game, well, one of them is rotting in prison, one of them is lost in time, and one of them died in a fire, is just like really, really vicious, and I quite like that. It's really not afraid to toy with the things that, your nostalgia and things like that. And I think the concept of Chrono Cross is amazing, where Chrono Trigger is this game about time travel and traveling through the same world at different points in time. I really like that when they came to do Cross, they really didn't want to do a sequel. They wanted to do another kind of a spiritual successor. So rather than it being time travel, it's dimension travel. So you're dealing with one period of time, but two dimensions where time has split based on an event that happens. And so the first thing that happens with you as a character is that you get drawn into this other dimension, and you find out that in this other dimension you died 10 years ago, which I think is a really great setup for a story, because it's like, oh, that's mystery, and I want to find out what happened to the previous me and what relation I have to the fact that there are these two split worlds, that diverted at this point, and I think that's to drop that on a player really early on is like a really nice lure to keep on playing, and also Chrono Cross does something really great where there's obviously like you're the main male character, obviously, because it's an old game, and there's a main female character, and one of the first things you see is a flash forward where you, as the main character, stab the female character through the chest and kill her, and then it immediately flashes back. So you have got like this, wow, like, I'm going to kill the other main character. How on earth is the game going to get to that point where that's something that happens? And in actuality, it's actually a really disappointing resolution to that. But again, it's like a setup. Again, having, when I looked at studying great game openings, that's one where you just immediately, you want to know more. It's a concept where you're just like, I want to find out so much more about what's going on, which is a sadly rare thing, because most games these days, how they kind of start, or what they're going to be about and where they're going to go, and so that's really something special. What else?
I think we'll go with one more game, because
okay.
So let's talk Nier, shall we?
Oh, okay. I was going to say Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2.
Okay. I'll let you go with 2. Silent Hill 2.
I'll do Silent Hill 2 very quickly, because there's not a huge amount to say about that. Silent Hill 2 was the game that made me realise how much artistry goes into making games. As you know, I'm sure you remember when it came out, it came with that documentary DVD that came with it. And I remember watching that and just being like, astonished about the care and thought that people put into making games, and that was kind of the final. Silent Hill 2 was the final nail in the coffin that made me want to work in games, because it was like it just shocked me the way that they tried to, the way that that everything in the game was disgusting, but they tried to make it attractive in some way to draw you towards it. Like that idea that there were this push and pull of attraction and repulsion, to me was just like, oh my god, that's like such an insane level of thought, which I didn't know went into games at that point. So Silent Hill 2 is very important for that, and obviously the story is great, and it's just a wonderful game in general. The other one, so yeah, I was also very quickly saying Metal Gear Solid 3, because I know you love Metal Gear Solid 3.
Yes.
Just because I think just the ending of that game is just phenomenal.
I think it's the best 7 minutes of a game you will ever see in a game. Like
it really is. And the boss is just a wonderful character, and that's the hardest. Like that's the hardest final fight of a game ever, because you don't want to kill her.
Yeah.
You're just like, no, you're wonderful. I like you. So yeah, that's incredible. I have to say that as an honourable mention, because it's just he's never done anything as good as that ever since. I don't have any doubt of that in my heart, even though some other people may obviously agree or disagree. I mean, so yeah, the final one, Nier. So yeah, Yoko Taro is my new Tetsuya Takahashi in some ways, in that he's the director I am obsessed about. Not that I'm not obsessed by Tetsuya Takahashi, but the original Nier is the game that I've cried the hardest at. When the credits rolled on that game, I sobbed harder than I have probably ever sobbed in my life. And that probably says something about the things that I've not faced in my life more than it does about the game. But it was proper heaving, like my face was wet, real, not just like tearing up, real crying, because that game is the game that I point to when I want to talk about, when I ever want to talk to people about tone, because that game has such a cohesive tone. It's this game that is about the death of humanity, basically, and it takes place in this post-apocalyptic world where that was originally the world that we're in now, but is gone back to being this almost like pastoral, fantasy land that JRPGs normally are, that fantasy stories normally are. And you see these relics of humanity around the place, like there's in one of the beginning areas, there's this giant railway bridge that's kind of like broken and in pieces, but it's looming there. It's everywhere you look, you can see this railway bridge, and no one in the world knows what even that was. Like, they've lost so much knowledge and comprehension that they just look at that and they're just like, we know that's what humanity used to be, but we don't know what a train is, and it's just this unbearing sense of melancholy, because it is about the decay of, it's the last gasp of humanity, that the entire of that game. It's humanity is under attack and really not doing very well, and really dying out, both from being attacked by these shades and by this disease, the Black Scrawl, and everything you're doing is feels kind of futile, and the music is really melancholy, and and a lot of these things are carried forward in Nier Automata, but it was the first thing where you just really felt, you just knew it was the end of days, but not in like a fire and brimstone way. It was just like humanity can't go on like this, and you're trying to save your daughter in it, in amongst all of this stuff, not really giving a shit about the rest of the world, because you're like, I don't care, my daughter's in danger, I need to save her. And then in the end, you doom the world. That's what you do. In classic Yoko Taro fashion, you are the bad guy. And your selfishness, Yoko Taro likes to have characters that are extremely stubborn, and they have a goal, and they will do absolutely anything to achieve their goal. And you know how, like, in most, the point of most stories is that characters change, they learn a lesson, they arc. Yoko Taro has said, like, I deliberately don't have my main characters do that. My main characters don't arc, and they suffer for it. They're so stubborn in what they want to do that they achieve it, or they don't achieve it, and it dooms everyone else. It's not really what they needed or what they wanted. So it almost, like, all of his games are basically tragedies, because they're about the downfall of a person, and Nier is the perfect, it's just the perfect example of that. As a game, there are so many things that are wrong with it. So I've always found it extremely hard to recommend people play Nier, because I'm like, you're really going to have to struggle through a bunch of shit, because not story-wise or character-wise, because the story and characters in the original era, I think, quite a lot better than Nier Automata, actually. But just the combat's okay. The graphics are bad. The frame rate is bad. There are a few parts of the game that are just like really bad game design. But if you can get past that, you just get this incredible, full sensory experience of melancholy, which, again, I just think is a masterclass of looking for one tone and just nailing it completely in everything, in the music, in the graphics, in the environment design, in the story, in the characters. It's just perfection in that sense, at least. And that's not even it has the prototype essentially of what Nier Automata does with the multiple endings. In that when you play it through the second time, you only play the second half because the game is a lot longer than one of the roots of Nier Automata. So you only play the second half of it again. But when you do it, you can understand what what the enemies are saying. And you get the story of Kaine, the woman, the kind of main female character, and just how awful her life has been. And it's just heartbreaking. And also finally understanding what the enemies are and that actually you were being a real dick to them. So it's very classic Yoko Taro, but gameplay-wise, I definitely think Nier Automata is better, and maybe structure-wise, Nier Automata is better, but I don't think the characters in Nier Automata are anywhere near as good as Kaine, as Emil, as Nier, as Devila, as Popula. It's just magic, and it was a very difficult decision whether I picked Xenogears or Nier as my favorite game, because I think Nier has done almost as much to change how I think about games and really affect me. But Xenogears just pips it because I played it at a more formative time of my life, so it was able to. Oh, but the other thing is, the interesting thing there is that Yoko Taro is the exact opposite of Tetsuya Takahashi in that he does not want to get any morals across. He very explicitly says, "I don't know what is right in life, what the right thing to do is. Maybe through playing my games, you'll come to learn it for yourself, but I don't have a moral to teach you." And so, that's one area where they're the complete opposite. And I think it's only through playing Nier Automata that I came to understand that you could let the player. I really came to really believe that you could let the player come to conclusions for themselves.
So with Xenogears, it changed your perception on how. With Nier, it changed your perception on how games could be, but with Xenogears, it changed your perception on life in a sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Which is why it's had a slight, a greater. Maybe if I'd have played Nier back, maybe if Nier had been a thing when I was 14, it might have spoken to me in a different way. And I think your favourite game is always going to have an element of rose-tintedness to it. Whereas, Nier is relatively recent. It's like 2010. So maybe I was a little bit more jaded by then. A little bit more knowing about possibilities. But yeah, I think what Nier showed me is how incredibly you can nail a feeling. Nier is not a great feeling. It's not meant to be a great feeling. It's meant to be, this is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. and you really feel that.
Top 3 games ever. How would you rank them? Obviously, Xenogears at the top, but like, what would be the other 2?
Xenogears first, Nier second, third. I think I'd probably have to put Final Fantasy VII, even though I've said it's not my favorite Final Fantasy.
It just opened your eyes in a sense.
Yeah, in terms of what it did to shape how I felt about games and also what I wanted to do with my life. It shaped my career. If I hadn't known that games could make you feel things and have these wonderful long stories, then I don't know if I'd ever wanted to become a game writer. So I think it would have to be that, but around the third place it gets very like there's really not much to put between a lot of the games I've mentioned, all of the games I've mentioned today.
Your fingertips moving gently to my heart. The force of life goes on and on. The song
Obviously, firstly, self-promotion. You can find me on Twitter. I am at EdFear. I talk a lot of shit. I would not be offended if you unfollow me. A lot of people do. and I'm fine with that. I've come to be okay with my own stylings. So as well as working at Mediatonic at the moment, I'm also a freelance games writer. I work at Mediatonic part-time, and then a couple of days a week I'm a freelance game writer, game designer. So there's been a few things that I've worked on this year that are coming out very soon. So we've got Kitty Powers' Love Life is out in February. I think they're aiming for Valentine's Day. It's a wonderful kind of sim type game hosted by Kitty Powers, the drag queen. It's wonderful fun. It's quite addictive. It's really funny and stupid. I did some mini game design on it. So there's that. But the main thing I'm working on at the moment is The Swords of Ditto, which is a game being published by Devolver Digital. And that's coming out at some early next year. I don't know when. My deadline is in 8 days, and I'm panicking to hell and back about that. But it's a wonderful little. It's like a roguelike Zelda, basically, where it's, instead of being one massive game, you play through these like mini, 2-hour mini Zeldas where you're kind of collecting gadgets and then going on to fight a big boss. But the big thing about it is that the world carries on whether you win or lose. So if you manage to defeat the great evil, then the world is happy for the next 100 years when you're resurrected. Or you were not resurrected, you take control of another character. If you fail, then evil reigns over the land, the world gets darker, the people get more miserable, the world, the buildings get more messed up, and there's more monsters around, and all sorts of things change. So depending on how well you do, the game changes a lot. So I've been writing on that for about 7 months now. There's a lot of random dialogue, a lot of really stupid and immature jokes. But also, firstly, it's just incredibly fun to play. It feels so good. It feels so Zelda. It's really replayable because you can play it loads. And we do have an overarching storyline, so you can do stuff that progresses a storyline over a couple of times as you play it. And then there's a lot of backstory that you can collect in these we call them ancient tablets, but they're basically iPads. Because again, it's slightly like Nier. It's set in a kind of fantasy world after a more technological civilization. But yeah, there's a backstory. There's kind of a backstory as well that you can piece together as you play through about the history of this place and the meanings behind the people that you are seeing in it now. So that's quite fun. No, I should say it's more than quite fun, really. It's very, very fun. And it's gorgeous. So that's The Swords of Ditto. And yeah, that's going to be out early 2018 on PS4 and PC. And that's the only ones I can talk about, I think. So consider my shit hawked.
Thanks for listening to My Favourite Game, a podcast on PlayDiaries.com where people in the games industry talk of their favourite game. Yes, my favourite game, after a 2-year hiatus away as a personal project of mine, is back. We're in the process of making a second attempt for Season 5, and we'll have more to share on that closer to the time. But until then, we have a few more episodes of these in the interim. If you want to listen to any future episodes of My Favourite Game early, as well as those from Press Play, and the upcoming regular podcast, The Journal, before they go live on PlayDiaries.com, you can subscribe to our $4 tier on Patreon at patreon.com/PlayDiaries. Next up, Alex Hutchinson on Exile. Until then, thanks for listening. Bye bye.